I'm joined by NCAA President Charlie Baker. Charlie, thank you for joining us.
It's nice to be with you.
Charlie, let's start here. I pulled a quote from the Trump administration's executive order, which came out in late July of this year. So this was after the House settlement had been formalized at this point.
Yep.
So there were, let me just read it. Here's a portion of it. Guardrails designed to ensure that these were legitimate market value NIL payments for endorsements or similar services rather than simply pay-for-play inducements were eliminated through litigation. Other limits on player transfers among schools were also taken down through litigation. This has created an out-of-control, rudderless system in which competing university donors engage in bidding wars for the best players who can change teams each season. Do you agree that that is the current state of play in college athletics?
Well, I guess, by the way, we very much appreciate the president's interest in this issue and his administration's engagement on it. And I've had some very productive conversations with folks on his team about it. I guess what I would say is I think that's a pretty apt description of the state of play before the injunction. I would argue that the injunction, which was approved by the federal court in July, I guess in late June, and took effect in July, has an answer for basically all of those questions. And what I've said to a lot of people about this is, you know, it took us a year and a half to negotiate the settlement, which eventually became the injunction, and we're now in a position where the College Sports Commission and all of the structure to deal with many of the issues that you just raised there has basically been in place for less than 90 days. And I think what we probably ought to do is put our shoulder to the wheel and try and make sure it works.
I mean, how's it going so far, in your opinion, in terms of instituting these new rules?
Well, I guess I would say that, you know, it's going to be a bumpy process. And by the way, I'm not saying that for the first time. I've said that pretty much since the beginning. And part of that's because the judge issued her decision, I think, around the second week of June. It became effective on July 1st. And Brian Seeley, God bless him, who's the gentleman who's running the CSC, has basically been in the job now for less than 60 days and has just a tremendous amount of stuff that he has to lift. And I think the fact that we do have, for the first time, a process people have to go through with respect to third-party deals, which were part of the piece you referenced from the president's executive order, is a big improvement for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is we'll finally know a little bit about what's real and what's not. The number of people who lie to student athletes and to their families about who gets what in the previous world was absolutely a problem. You had all kinds of kids going into the portal based on false promises and misrepresentations. And that's why about a third of the student athletes who went into the transfer portal didn't really end up anywhere as far as we could tell. And I've talked to a bunch of those kids, and the answer I get from them when I say, you know, how did this end up happening, was people basically misrepresented what kind of opportunity might have been available for them. They were just collecting people to turn around and try and, you know, find some place for. And I think at a minimum, you know, having a school-based program in NIL, which we started talking about in the fall of 23, which gives schools the opportunity to sort of take back some of the relationship between student athletes and programs around this stuff, will also help deal with some of that stuff. So I basically think this thing is new. It's never been done before. It's basically just gotten started. What we really ought to be doing is putting our shoulder to the wheel and trying to make sure it works.
Your priority is obviously to the student athletes and to the programs themselves, but there's certainly sentiment among college sports fans that the way the transfer portal works right now, the way NIL is shifting the dynamics between teams, I mean, we saw like a record low upsets this year in the men's NCAA tournament. There's certainly a camp of people out there that says these changes are kind of destroying college sports. They're destroying the magic. They're destroying rivalries. Is that your concern? Are fans' concerns your concerns?
Well, there's a lot of fans. There's a lot of fans with a lot of opinions out there, Alex. I think, look, I'm a fan. Okay, you know, I played college sports. My wife played college sports. My boys played college sports. It's really important to us as a family, and I've certainly attended more than my fair share of games over the years. But I think I'd say two things about that. The first is, if you just look at, for example, the viewership numbers on our championships, right, which involve everything except football, which is, you know, football numbers are up, attendance and fan viewership are up significantly there. But in all the other sports, they're up as well. And when people say that, you know, the past year we had fewer upsets, well, you know, let's see what happens this year. I mean, the thing about the tournament that I think is really important for people to remember, whichever one you're talking about, is strange things happen. I mean, Vermont won the men's national collegiate soccer championship. Coastal Carolina made it all the way to the final two in the men's baseball tournament. Texas Tech, for the first time ever, made it to the finals in the women's softball tournament. The basketball tournament on the men's side didn't have as many upsets as it's had in the past, but that's because it always has a lot of upsets. Let's see what happens going forward. I'm not that worried about that. And I think basketball in particular is one of those sports where in the NIL world, there are going to be a lot of basketball schools that will compete quite well with some of the so-called bigger brands.
You talked about some of the smaller sports there. Obviously, some of the new changes, there's a concern. I mean, I spoke with the NWSL Commissioner Jessica Berman about this, and she said, if you are not concerned about the state of Title IX right now, you've got your head in the sand. Are you concerned about the state of Title IX right now?
Well, based on what I have, which is anecdotal information I've gathered from campuses, by the time we get to the end of the year, school year, right? So that's the spring of 26, and all of the schools report their data on scholarships and everything else. I am virtually certain we're going to discover that there are far more women student athletes scholarshiped in 25, 26 than there were in 24, 25. Thousands of new scholarships for women in collegiate sports will have been issued over the course of this year. The data we have so far shows there are more student athlete opportunities in Division I as the year begins, based on what schools have told us about how they're planning to fill their rosters than they did last year. I get the fact that everybody's nervous about this new world, and I understand that. But what I'm going to do is focus on the data and the information and the conversations and discussions that I have with people who are in the arena, so-called, about what's actually going on the ground. And are there going to be things that are going to be changes that make people uncomfortable? Yes, but we were way overdue for that. You know, it made people uncomfortable when we put the post-eligibility health insurance program in for kids who get injured playing their sport on campus, so that 2 years after they leave, they can continue to have access to healthcare services. It made people uncomfortable when we put the core guarantees in around scholarships and support, mental health support and health and well-being supports, because they're changes. But I think I'm nowhere near as concerned about some of that stuff as I am about getting some of the pieces of the reforms that are being put into place now right. If we don't get those right, then we got all kinds of other issues. And part of the reason why we've been engaged with folks in Washington, you mentioned the transfer portal. We had a pretty reasonable transfer policy, and it got blown up in a West Virginia court, right? If the NCAA can't make basic rules, which is one of the things we're asking for Congress to give us, limited liability protection on a few issues, whether it's the transfer portal or eligibility or academic eligibility. I mean, those are things that are, you want to blow up college sports, get rid of those things. And from my point of view, those are some of the things we're trying to preserve and protect with this conversation we've been having in DC, which
You led
frankly we've made some progress on.
You led right into my next question, Charlie, which is that are there, because you just mentioned a couple of them, but I'll push you a little further. Are there specific certain areas where you wish the NCAA had more power and control than you have today?
Well, I think this limited liability question around, having some sort of transfer policy that's predictable, not just for coaches and athletic directors, but for student athletes would be nice. I think continuing to have a commitment to academic eligibility, that's kind of fundamental, and it's currently being debated in a variety of courthouses around the country. Now, we've won way more of those cases so far than we've lost, and judges seem to be pretty committed to the idea that, 5 years to play 4 is a pro-competitive standard, and tying it to an academic calendar and to academic performance is sort of fundamental to the idea about being a college athlete. But I think the whole issue around the two other things we've been talking to DC about, one is state preemption. You now have 40 different laws in which states basically pass laws that are designed to give their schools a leg up over other schools in other states around NIL and that sort of thing. I mean, that's not just an NCAA problem, that's a conference problem as well, since most of the conferences obviously are multi-state. But I think I think the real challenge here is, do we want to preserve what we think works about college sports? At the same time, we implement changes that everybody's been demanding for years, in particular the one around rev share for kids who play in high revenue sports, and continue to create a model that has enough flexibility in it so that schools can continue to make the investments that they need to make in what we call the so-called low revenue sports. I hate that term, by the way. I think of those programs as basically being terrific elements of the constellation that is college sports. And it has a lot to do with why there's 500,000 kids playing college sports and learning all the lessons that come with that.
Is there a better euphemism for the low revenue sports? I'll adopt it if you can come up with a term for it.
I think of them as potentials, right? I mean, we're building a fan database, right? And remember, we have all the championships except football. So we have all the championships in the so-called low revenue sports, right? Those low revenue sports almost across the board are doing better in viewership and attendance than they've done previously. And this fan database gives us the ability. We have 16 million people in it at this point. And just by doing our job every year, we'll add millions of people to this database. And we've now started sharing this information with schools where we know who the fans are in, pick a sport: volleyball, indoor, outdoor track, ice hockey, field hockey, soccer. You can sort of go through the list where we're starting to collect an enormous amount of fan data on who the fans are, which teams they follow, where they live. And I think over time, as we continue to grow this thing and make it available to schools, it's going to create a connection between schools and sports fans who historically have not had a digital way to relate to one another. And I think it can do two things. Number one, drive attendance, and number two, drive viewership, which will obviously increase revenue.
Do you have a sense of how close we are to seeing private equity money actually securitize some of these sports teams? And also, how do you envision that actually working from a sort of specific standpoint?
I guess what I would say is that, schools and conferences got to make their own call with respect to this stuff. I kind of get the idea of using private equity money to do, singular specific things: building a practice facility, rehabbing your football stadium, stuff like that, where There's an actual project. You need to put capital into it. You can calculate what the return will be. You'll get the benefit of the expertise in private equity around how you structure the deal and how you organize what it is you're trying to do there. But when you get into, quote, investing in the programming, the single biggest thing I would say, and this is what I hear when I talk to schools about it, is the amount of control that they would have to give up to take on that type of a partnership. It's really an ownership, right? Is profound. And I think for many of them, that might be just a bridge too far, at least at this point in time. Because in that kind of a situation, you're literally, you run a program, all the big programs, right? Basically make money on a couple of sports, lose money on the rest, and use some of the money that they make on the sports that do make money to fund a lot of the rest of the stuff they do, which they consider to be part of their holistic approach to sports and campus experiences and everything else. And that's why most of them break even or lose money overall. So if you get into a relationship with a partner in private equity around the actual operation of your programs, you're going to have to figure out in advance how much control you give to them, what type of earning is going to be required by them to invest in your program, and what kind of impact that's going to have on the full complement of sports and programs that you make available. And I think those are the right questions for people to be asking. The easier thing to do would be to think about it in terms of the stuff I started with, things where there's like a project that has a beginning date and end date, and where you might want a capital partner to help you build something and make sure you build it well, build it right, and finance it and operate it on terms that make it successful.
I asked sports investor Mark Lazary about this. He suggested sort of a third alternative there, which was like you kind of develop almost derivative securities around these teams where you're buying 10% of revenue and you're basically holding it for X amount of years, and then the idea would be they use the cash, they get better players, the revenue goes up, and then the private equity firm simply takes the percentage of the revenue X years down the road. Does that make sense to you?
I guess the question I would have there would still come back to the question about control, right? How much control are you giving up for that? Just think about how much debate and discussion there was about afternoon versus evening games in both the Big Ten, the CFP, and the SEC last year. I mean, it's a really complicated, challenging issue in one sport, in football, and if you think about the way the PE piece works, they're not going to want to spend a lot of time debating with you about what the best window is. They're going to want you to play in it, period. And I think that's where some of the challenge comes from. The idea of writing a derivative security around that and having it tied purely to player acquisition is kind of the way you were describing it. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that before. So I'm gonna punt on that one today, because that's an idea that I hadn't heard before.
I want to talk a little bit about the consistent shuffling of conference realignment. Does part of you look at this and say, we're trying to jam a round peg into a square hole, or vice versa, whatever that analogy is here, and that we're trying to keep these legacy institutions alive, and we're really stretching kind of the bounds of realism to do this, where we've got conferences that, the Big Ten has 18 schools or 22 schools or whatever it may be. Like, should we just kind of start over here in your mind?
Well, it's going to be hard to start over for a bunch of reasons. First of all, the schools and the conferences have interlocking relationships with each other, right? And commitments they've made. And those are also tied, as you know, to their TV agreements. I think it would be enormously challenging to do anything other than accept the fact that you get windows here where you can do this sort of thing. And those windows are tied to both the school's commitments to each other and also the commitments that they have to their media rights agreements. And And so that creates open windows every few years in which people can sort of engage in these discussions. I think I guess what I would say about that is we now have a situation where you have four conferences that are sort of considered to be the biggest and most well-funded. You have six more that are kind of, the group of six that's right under them. And then a whole ton of other schools spread across Division One and in a variety of conferences. And by the way, there's been, there's been some realignment at that level as well for a bunch of other strategic reasons. And I think what's going to happen here, at least what I hope happens, is if the College Sports Commission gets up and operating, schools have this opportunity to participate more directly in NIL programming. The third-party NIL process for review and approval kind of sticks and works. In a year or two, we're going to know a lot more about how schools have chosen to strategically engage in this. And that may have some impact on how they choose to decide which sports and which conferences they're going to choose to align themselves with. Because there's going to be some movement there, but I think the arrival of the new mechanism and the injunction creates what I would describe as an uncertainty that people are going to have to get a better feel for before they make decisions about doing something else. And as you know better than anybody, the other big media deals aren't up until the end of this decade.
They're locked up for a long time. That's right. So yes, my question was sort of baked in the notion that nothing is going to change for quite a while here, to your point, as these rights are locked up.
It would be very hard. Yeah.
I also want to talk about sports betting because you have talked repeatedly about this notion of protecting students from online harassment around sports betting from bettors. Does something more drastic need to take place to protect college sports from sports betting?
Well, obviously, I would like to get prop betting as out of college sports as I possibly can, because that is, in some respects, the piece that's caused the most havoc for young people. Whether a team wins or loses is one thing, but when you have people behind the bench or standing by the entrance into the stadium or into the arena, screaming at these kids about, not making bank on whatever it was they bet on them, is just horrific. And the stuff that shows up in there, we track in our championships, we track a lot of the traffic that's directed to them at their public handle. But the direct message stuff is way worse than the stuff that we see in the public piece. And the public stuff is pretty grim. And I think for us, the big goal is get rid of prop betting to the fullest extent possible. And so far, more than half of the states aren't doing prop betting, and we're trying to negotiate our way out of getting some of the rest of them out. I think the other thing I would say about all this sports betting stuff is we run the biggest integrity program in the world. I mean, we track an enormous amount of traffic in this space. And I think the deal we made with Venmo to create some protections and some opportunities for kids to express to the company really bad behavior that's being directed at them through Venmo is another way of sort of getting at this. And we've also educated over 100,000 student athletes with our on-campus programming around things you should be aware of, things you should pay attention to, things you should you should treat as sort of trigger moments if somebody starts to approach you in this particular way and talk to you about this. And most of that is being done on campus by former student athletes talking about how somebody pulled them in and got them in basically deep and then in trouble because of that. And we've also been pretty clear with kids on campus that if you get into a bad spot on this, come talk to somebody, and nobody's going to get punished for that. We want you to feel like you can come forward if you've put yourself in a corner.
Are you worried at all that with the infusion of money now into the college sports system, that it will breed a sense of inequality between sort of the haves and the have-not of athletes, and that may lead to an environment that would be more likely for a sports betting scandal?
I think the good, as much as I dislike all the prop betting activity and the baloney that gets directed at kids as a result of that, I do think the fact that so much of this traffic is now taking place, quote unquote, above board is helpful with regard to some of that. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of messaging being delivered to kids on campus about being able to come forward and to be able to do that in a safe way. I think the infusion of money generally, I mean, some of it, from my point of view, was long overdue. I mean, I was talking about school-based NIL 6 months after I got here to the NCAA back in 23. And I think the big challenge for us is to make sure that there's transparency around what's actually happening and what's going on. And again, I come back to an earlier point I made, which is certain schools are going to make certain investments in certain sports because those are the ones that they believe they have the biggest, best, and most significant opportunity to succeed in. And I actually think net, the more of this that's above board, the easier it is for everybody to sort of keep track of what's going on. And so much of it was sort of not above board historically, and I think that actually probably created more problems. And the first couple of years of NIL, I would argue, was all off the books, and that was a problem too. I mean, having this stuff with a process that's, been approved by the federal government with rules and structure, I just think for kids generally and for their families, that's a way better place to be than where we were previously, where you didn't know who to believe about anything. And where the kids at the very top would be really, really well represented, and basically everybody else would be taking their chances.
You played basketball at Harvard. I went to Harvard too. I'm curious your thoughts on if the Ivy League will opt in to NIL eventually.
So far they've said no, and I completely understand their perspective on that one. And at some point, they'll just have to decide where and how they'll have to make a strategic decision, just like everybody else, about where and how they want to participate. I mean, obviously, the Ivy League is incredibly generous with respect to financial and academic aid. I mean, I think the number at Harvard now is you make 200 grand. If your family makes 200 grand or less, you go for free. That's a heck of I mean, that is a big opportunity, I think, for a lot of folks. And I'm glad they're doing it. But I think at some point they just kind of have to decide how they fit into the grander scheme of all this. And I think for the Patriot League, which is another league that at the conference level opted out as well, they've got some decisions to make as well. And the other thing I would say is in a whole bunch of sports, outside of what we think of as the big brand sports, I think the Ivy League will continue on the men's and the women's side to be very competitive. But again, that's something they got to think about. I mean, you can do other things besides NIL. I mean, the Supreme Court and the NCAA and the injunction all basically created a big opportunity around Alston payments, which are supposed to be tied to academic performance. And that's the kind of place, you can't do what you can do with NIL there, but there are definitely things you could do with Alston payments that are specifically related to how you perform academically, which would seem to me to be pretty consistent with where the Patriot League and the Ivy League and some of those others come from.
You are participating in this TedSports Indianapolis conference, the first TED Talk of its kind for sports. What motivated you to be a part of this? And I guess by the time this airs, maybe your speech will have aired, but give us a preview of what you plan on saying.
Look, I've always been a big believer that a lot of what you learn in sports is wildly underappreciated. Learning about the grind, learning about being a teammate, learning about putting your interests aside for the greater good, taking constructive criticism, giving constructive criticism, learning how to lose with grace and win with dignity. I mean, there's so many lessons in sports, and I think what I'm going to probably end up talking about is that the fact that sports is about a lot more, especially youth sports and collegiate sports are about a lot more than just, the glam that everybody sees with the top 5% of the programs or the folks who play professionally. And, you talk to almost any former student athlete and they'll tell you who's not playing professionally and never was going to play professionally. And they'll all tell you that the lessons they learned playing sports, they've been able to apply over and over again in almost every aspect of their life. And I'm likely to speak to how important it is that we not forget that.
Charlie Baker, appreciate you joining us.
It's nice to see you, Alex. Go Crimson.
Likewise.